Good evening, everybody. Good evening. Thank you for coming to Gratz College. I know many of you here, and many more of you may know me, but in case you don't, my name is Paul Finkelman, and I have the honor of being the president of Gratz College. And welcome to the college, and welcome to tonight's Shusterman Lecture. The Shusterman Lecture was created by Murray Shusterman of blessed memory, and the Shusterman family, including his son Bob, who is here tonight, continues to be very supportive of Gratz. It is through the Shusterman Lecture that we bring distinguished scholars and academics to the college. I should add, and I'm not sure whether I should say this in the context of talking about distinguished scholars, but about a decade before I became the president of Gratz, I had the honor of being the Shusterman Lecturer myself. So sometimes they're not so distinguished. But in any event, tonight we have a remarkable event. Rather than the traditional lecture, we will have a dialogue between David Weinstein, who is a member of the Board of Governors of Gratz College, a former chair of the Board of Governors, a recipient of an honorary doctorate from Gratz College, so he is Dr. Weinstein. David has been practicing law in Philadelphia for many, many years. He was a clerk for two different judges on the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, which is in California, which he did after he attended Berkeley Law School. David has been a public interest lawyer. He has been an advocate for people who needed a strong advocate, often against institutions that were perhaps less concerned about individuals. Currently, David is involved in a case called Simon versus Hungary, Hungary being the nation of Hungary, and more importantly, the Hungarian National Railroad. He has been suing the railroad and Hungary for nearly a decade for restitution for property taken from Jews who lived in Hungary at the time of the Shoah, and whose property was taken from them as they were being deported to Auschwitz. So David is both an important supporter of Gratz, an important attorney for people who are seeking justice, and he is an active member of many other organizations and institutions in this community. He will be talking to Debbie Cenziper. Debbie is a native of Philadelphia, so this is sort of homecoming week for people. She has worked for the Miami Herald, the Charlotte Observer, the South Florida Sun Sentinel, and in 2007 she won the Pulitzer Prize for journalism, working for the Miami Herald for stories she had written in 2006 on corruption and waste in the Miami-Dade Housing Agency. She subsequently went to the Washington Post. She is now a professor at the Medill School of Journalism, which is connected to Northwestern University, but she is based in Washington, and so students normally come to her, although she did say at dinner that she was in Evanston 3 times a month, or was it 3 times a week? Every week. She was there every week for much of this fall, so she's been collecting frequent flyer miles and losing sleep. She is the co-author of the book Love Wins, The Lovers and Lawyers Who Fought the Landmark Case for Marriage Equality. And more recently, of course, she is the author of Citizen 865, which is why she is here tonight. I have read Citizen 865. I reviewed it in the Exponent here in Philadelphia. It is an enormously important book. I live by books. I write books, I read books, I review books. I rarely tell other people they need to read a book, because if I start, I'll never stop. But this is a book you all need to read. This is a book that you need to give to your friends. This is a book that your children need to read. This is a book that the next generation of people need to know and know about, because it is both about the Shoah, people who survived and the perpetrators, and how a number of the perpetrators lied their way into the United States, lied about their past experience, lied about their horrific criminal behavior, and managed to live out much of the rest of their lives in peace in the United States, flying under the radar and not letting their neighbors or their friends or their employers or sometimes even their spouses know what they had done as they murdered people during the Shoah. And this is a story about how the Justice Department found those people, how a courageous young member of Congress from Brooklyn, Elizabeth Holtzman, pushed through a statute to create a special investigative team within the Justice Department, had the law passed, President Carter signed it, and it went into effect. And in the next quarter century, the Justice Department managed to find some justice for some people by taking away their citizenship, which they were not entitled to, and sending them back to the places they came from. And I don't want to say any more about the book because I want to leave it to these two distinguished people to have a conversation. All of you have received or had the opportunity to get little 3x5 cards where you can write questions down. At some point towards the end, we will collect your questions and bring them to the panelists, and they will answer as many as they can. And without any more, I want to first thank again Bob Shusterman and the Shusterman family for making an event like this happen, and for Debbie Cenziper, who's willing to come all the way from the boring, dull, where nothing ever happens interesting city of Washington to home in Philadelphia. Thank you for being here.
Did he tell it all? Not at all.
Great synopsis.
No. So I really appreciate the opportunity for us to chat this evening. And I hope that what we talk about will not only inform the audience more about the details that are in the book, but will hopefully light some fires for people to have questions to have us confront that may not be in part of our conversation directly. And I hope that all of you will take the opportunity to think about a question. Well, obviously, we're not going to have 200 questions after the main presentation, but please, if you have something you think is important for everyone to hear, feel free to submit that. So we heard a little bit about the fact that you're from Philadelphia originally. Could you elaborate a little bit about your roots here in our community before we get into the substance of the book?
Of course, yeah. My whole family lived in Philadelphia for years. My parents and my grandmother's actually still living. She's 97 years old, and she's in Florida. But my extended family is still here, so I have aunts, uncles, and cousins, both in Bryn Mawr and Ambler. And my grandfather back in the day owned a series of shoe stores all over Philadelphia. And my other set of grandparents lived off of Bustleton Avenue for 50 years. So when people ask where home is, though I haven't lived here in a long time, I always say Philadelphia.
Great. I'm not originally from here, but this is clearly a home for me. We'll have to talk a little bit about the book and before we can even discuss it.
Yes.
I hope the audience has the understanding that this is a book of nonfiction, but it reads very much like a thriller novel, and it contains some incredible information that you dug up because you are, in fact, an investigative reporter. I think we'd all like to know, because the subject matter, as we will find out later as we go through it, is really a very small part of the total story of the Shoah. Nevertheless, it's an important one. How is it that you came to write this book?
Right. So I was at a New Year's Eve party in the suburbs of Maryland, and in the final moments of 2016, when my husband was kind of pointing toward the door because he was so ready to go and didn't want to hear disco music anymore, I fell into a conversation with a Justice Department lawyer. And over the course of a conversation that lasted well into the new year, she started telling me about this tiny unit deep inside the criminal division of the US Department of Justice that had spent more than 3 decades searching for Nazi war criminals and collaborators here in the United States. And I remember thinking that night, how was it possible that Hitler's helpers, Nazi war criminals, were still living in the United States so many decades after the end of the war? I found that outrageous. Even though I had been on staff at the Washington Post for 10 years, I knew very little about this unit or its mission or the fact that they were still searching for these men. And my other question that night was, who were the men and women inside this unit, the historians and the lawyers, the prosecutors, who had spent years reliving some of the darkest moments in recent history? And how were they able to separate that from their private lives? How are they able to go home at night to their husbands and wives and children and live relatively ordinary lives when by day they were not only interviewing survivors and witnesses, but mass murderers who described murder in such technical, chilling terms? I was fascinated by that backstory, which is at the heart of this book. And so a couple of days after that conversation, I called up an historian who was a central character in the book, a woman named Barry White. And she's now at the US Holocaust Museum, but she worked inside this unit for years. And Barry recounted to me the story that convinced me to write this book. And that is, very quickly, in 1990, she and a handful of historians inside this Nazi hunting unit flew to Prague, because the Nazis had stashed thousands of pages of rosters and records in Prague after the war. But the West could never see the records. Our historians and scholars and investigators had always been barred from going to Prague by the communist government. So we had no idea what was there. Well, when communism collapsed, we finally got this invitation to go to Prague. So poor Barry is 3 months pregnant, flying into Prague. They find their rental apartment in the middle of the night, and the Russian caretaker wants Barry to eat pork cutlets and beer for breakfast, and she is, of course, nauseous and 3 months pregnant. They get up the next morning, they get into a black government sedan, and they finally go to the archives. They don't know what they're gonna find. And in this dusty basement archive, Barry and her colleague, a man named Peter Black, stood before government agents with guns in their holsters, and Peter Black had to say through an interpreter, "My name is Peter Black, this is Barry White, we're here to represent the US Department of Justice." And all the agents smirked, thinking, the CIA has no imagination. These must be spies. But they really are historians, and off they go into the archives, and poor Barry is running to the bathroom because she has morning sickness, and the bathroom is in a shaft of an elevator with a chain that flushes the toilet, and every hour she's in there, and finally she pushes back her chair, and she says, "I have something," and she runs over to Peter Black. Barry found a Nazi roster from 1945 that listed the names of men who served in this obscure training camp, which is at the heart of Citizen 865. And Peter and Barry immediately recognized what they were looking at. It was a roster of 700 men who had served in what amounted to a school for mass murder in occupied Poland. And what's more, some of the men were living in the United States and had been for years. And that prompted a 15-year investigation at the Justice Department, and that's how the book got started.
Wow. Incredible.
Yeah.
How did you know to call Barry White to start with?
Yeah, that's a good question. I have not been asked that question yet. First of all, she was the only female historian doing this work inside the Justice Department. So I was just really wanting to get to know her. I'm an investigative reporter, so I relate to historians because they get their hands on documents that no one had ever seen before. I love that. That's the investigative reporter geek in me, is I want to see those documents. And so I just thought she'd be a good first person to call.
Right. You know, from my experience with dealing with the federal government and especially the Justice Department, it's really unusual for a unit to be staffed by historians.
Yes.
Attorneys, of course.
Yes.
And investigators and paralegals. But this unit, which we really haven't named, it's the Office of Special Investigations, the OSI. This unit emphasized the importance of investigating the past, and you do that not with gumshoe street-bound investigators, but with bona fide historians.
Yep. In fact, when this unit was created by Elizabeth Holtzman, a Brooklyn congresswoman in 1979, they were staffed by investigators. One came from the IRS, one came from Fish and Wildlife, one came from, far off remote places inside the federal government. Well, how can you investigate Nazi war criminals living in the United States with people that didn't understand Nazi Germany? And so they needed historians because they needed to put history in context. And they needed historians to sit in on interviews with suspects because the historians could pick up on lies. They could use history against them. And that's in fact what they did. And I was fascinated by the work of the historians because these were men and Barry White working in this remote outpost of the Justice Department with stained drop ceilings and mice that scattered across the tips of wingtip loafers, and they faced a McDonald's, and these were not sexy, sensational jobs. The lawyers and prosecutors got some attention, but not the historians, and they pieced these puzzles together, and that fascinated me.
So we haven't yet named the training camp or the men.
Right.
The training camp was outside of a little town, which itself was outside of Lublin.
It was.
In Poland. And the name of the town is Trawnicki.
Right.
And the trainees, the graduates of this camp, were referred to as Trawnicki men. And many of the books, before I even read your book, I've read a good number of books on the Holocaust, and I have seen references to the Trawnicki men not understanding the way I now do, having read your book, what the camp was and what its function was and how central it was to the effectuation of the mass murder of the Jews in Poland. So I thought it was interesting to me that you, in your introduction to the book, said that the story of the Trawnicki men was, your words, particularly compelling. So I think it would be helpful for all of us to know, what was it about these particular trainees and the program of the camp that you found particularly compelling, especially in the context of hunting them down in the United States?
Yeah, the fact is this was really an unexplored piece of Holocaust history, at least in the West. In the East, people knew, the Soviets knew, the Poles knew about this camp. In the West, we didn't know very much about it because we couldn't get access to the archives behind the Iron Curtain. And so I was intrigued by the fact that there was this piece of history that we didn't know about. But then there's just sheer numbers. The Trawnicki men, without the Trawnicki men, there is no way the SS could have killed so many people so quickly in occupied Poland. With the help of the men of Trawnicki, they murdered 1.7 million Jews in fewer than 20 months, the span of 2 Polish summers. And so one of the things that struck me as a journalist, as a human being, is just how many people it takes to commit mass murder. So a little bit of background. The Travnicki men were not members of the SS or the Nazi Party. They were recruited, many of them pulled from Soviet POW camps. They were captured Soviet soldiers, captured Red Army soldiers. And what happened in the early years of the war is the SS realized they didn't have the manpower to staff the concentration camps and killing centers in occupied Poland. They needed boots on the ground. They needed help. So they recruited 5,000 men, Red Army soldiers, and just other recruits, Ukrainians, Latvians, Lithuanians. They brought them to the small farming village called Travnicki, south of Warsaw. You can see it here on this map. And Travnicki was a good strategic location because there were rail lines that linked this little farming village to all the major city centers in Poland. And so what they did is they brought these 5,000 men to Travnicki, they trained them, they armed them, and then they deployed them across occupied Poland on the deadliest, bloodiest, most brutal missions in occupied Poland. They liquidated the ghettos, they participated in mass killing sprees, shooting sprees, and they operated the gas chambers and the killing centers. So just briefly, two minutes of quick history here. The first place they went was Lublin because Travnicki was near Lublin. Lublin had 40,000 Jews before the war, and the Travnicki men went to Lublin. That's the outside of the ghetto. They surrounded the perimeter of the ghetto late at night. They lighted the street lamps. They called everyone outside. The sick and elderly were shot on the spot, their bodies left on cobblestone streets. They announced that 1,500 people would be taken away and resettled in the East, which is Nazi code for murder. And over a period of months, the Travnicki men brought about 35 or so thousand Jews to the trains that were parked outside of Lublin, and the Jews didn't know it at the time, but they were taken to the Belzec killing center. And I say killing center, not concentration camp, because this was a center built solely for death. There were no barracks. Jews were taken off the trains and directed right into the gas chambers. The Travnicki men also went into the Jewish orphanage in Lublin, killed the children there, killed the caregivers that refused to leave the children behind. And they went to the Jewish hospital, killed the patients and the doctors and nurses. This was just their very first mission. And then they went all around Warsaw. They fought side by side with the Germans during the Jewish uprising in the Warsaw Ghetto. This camp was so essential to the SS that Himmler came to visit at least twice. So that's a little bit of history about this training camp. And after the war, the men deserted, they scattered across Europe, and because the United States didn't know much about Travnicki, we let them in.
Of course, they also lied about their
And they
own.
lied about their activities and whereabouts
yeah.
during the war. That's right.
So, there's so many unsettling things about the story of the Travnicki men. I'd like to focus for a moment on one part of what you explained to us, and that is that we're talking about the mass murderers who were not Germans.
No.
We always think of the Shoah as having been the result of Nazi ideology and effectuation by the Wehrmacht and the SS, all of which were German institutions. And yet, the Travnicki men were not German.
No. In fact, they were not German. They were the foot soldiers, to quote an historian in the book. They were the foot soldiers of the Third Reich. And in fact, Jewish survivors didn't know they were Travnicki men. They often called them blackies because they wore black coats and black caps. But Jewish survivors to this day, including the survivors in my book, said that the Travnicki men, or the Ukrainians they called them, or the blackies, were more violent than members of the SS. They did the dirtiest, most brutal jobs in occupied Poland. They walked away with blood on their hands.
So it seems to me that this is, when I first read that in the book, and I came to realize that our conception, if you will, maybe our myth about what the Shoah was does not take into account the participation in this formal way of not just the Soviet POWs, but as well the men and women who lived in Ukraine, Lithuania, the Baltic states, and they were very much perpetrators of the Shoah as well. And it's something I know I'm still grappling with, and it has a lot of implications. I'm wondering if you've had any thoughts about that.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about how many people collaborated to kill as many people as we lost, they went on to live and die in peace. We'll never know hundreds of thousands of collaborators in the Holocaust. We'll never know. They just went on to live their lives. And so did many members of the Travniki training camp. There were 5,000. I think the Justice Department tracked 16 here in the United States that we know of. In fact, the last known Travniki man in the United States was just deported from Queens, New York in 2018, last year, after living 50-some years on a quiet street in Queens, New York. So, you know, they were essentially able to live their lives in peace, and some of them died in peace.
Yes, apropos of that, I noticed that just last week, the Supreme Court of Canada, for the very first time in Canadian history, affirmed the stripping of Canadian citizenship of a participant in the Shoah.
Yes, and in fact, Canada's Nazi hunting unit was modeled after ours at the Justice Department. And in fact, the man that they affirmed a lower court's denaturalization order.
Correct.
Very, very violent Nazi collaborator, but what hadn't been reported is that he was actually found by the Office of Special Investigations 2 decades ago living in Marco Island, Florida. And our Justice Department, the people in the book, the heroes of the book, tracked him down in Marco Island, Florida, and forced him to return to Canada to face allegations of his participation in the Nazi persecution. Yeah. So if it weren't for this Justice Department and this unit, I don't know what would have happened.
So I think it would be helpful for everyone here to have a little understanding of the technical procedures. Now, we're talking about a department or an office within the criminal division of the Justice Department. You would think it was an office that is charging people with crimes and getting them put in jail.
Yes.
But in fact, that's not what they were doing at all. So can you explain for us what the process was? It was a two-stage process.
Yes.
Hopefully the second one was successful, but not always.
No.
So why don't you explain for the audience what that's about?
So though these men found on U.S. soil, and there were many more than just the Travniki men, there were hundreds of investigations over 30 years by this little unit inside Justice, they couldn't try them in a criminal court because, and you're the lawyer, but it violates the Constitution. They couldn't at the time try people for crimes committed on foreign soil here in the United States. They could have if they had spent the time trying to get the Constitution changed, but they were racing against time. Think about it. These suspects were growing older. The witnesses were growing older. Survivors were growing older. So they were facing the clock. And so the best option they had was to take them to civil court and try to strip them of their U.S. citizenship. These were men who came into the country by lying about their whereabouts. They ultimately became U.S. citizens. They stood before the Constitution and vowed to defend the United States. So these were men who had pensions and Social Security cards and benefits. They had wives. They had American children. They went to church. They had everything here. So the only thing they could do, their best course of action, was to strip them of their citizenship before a federal judge and then take them to immigration court and seek deportation. And that was the best thing that they could do to at least remove them from U.S. soil. And they wanted to do this, and they point this out, and I found this very interesting. not just for the survivors and their families, but also for the war veterans, our veterans who had crossed an ocean to free the Jews of Europe. So they felt like it was a slap in the face to have these men here. They'd obtained their visas illegally. They had come in and should never have been here in the first place. So they did what they could under the law. I think they wished they could have done more, but they did what they could.
Yeah. And so the term denaturalization is the formal technical term for stripping them of their citizenship.
Yeah, and they didn't see it, the Justice Department lawyers did not see it as revenge. They did not see it as retribution. They saw it as taking back what these men shouldn't have had in the first place. By getting a visa, they took a spot that could have been given to someone else, including a survivor of the Holocaust. So they saw it as accountability, as justice, but not necessarily as retribution or revenge. They went after these cases in a very meticulous way.
Most of them came in under the Displaced Persons Act of 1947?
48, I think.
48.
And beyond.
Yes, and then in
that.
1953 it was amended and extended.
Right.
And so that was special legislation that, in which our Congress had dealt with the flood of refugees after the war.
Especially those who claim they were fleeing communism.
Yes.
You know, we were in the Cold War, so we wanted to let these people in. But you know, I should tell you that this tiny unit, if I may, flip forward for just a second. Sorry, let me show you this man, if I may. I don't know, do you know who that is? Yeah. The Justice Department faced incredible backlash in trying to remove these men from U.S. soil. You wouldn't think that they would, but they did. First of all, Pat Buchanan, everyone remember Pat Buchanan, called for the shuttering of this unit for years. Why are we going after little old men? What's in the past is the past. Leave them alone. You know, we're getting evidence from the Soviet Union. We can't rely on evidence from the Soviet Union. Different Ukrainian groups wanted to shutter this unit. So for years, they were racing against time because they faced political opposition here and abroad. Once they got the deportation orders, Germany and Austria did not want to take these men back. So there was nowhere to send them once there was an order for their deportation. This man here was named Michael Bernstein, and he was a storied prosecutor within the unit. And one day, just before Hanukkah in 1988, Michael got word that Austria was relenting and that Austria was thinking of taking back Austrian-born Nazi perpetrators found in the United States. So Michael had two kids at the time. One was 4, one was 7, and right before Hanukkah, he was asked to fly to Vienna to sign the deal with Austria. And Mike flew to Vienna, and it was just this monumental victory. Finally, Austria, after resisting for years, was going to take back our Nazi perpetrators from Austria. He signed, got the agreement signed. He was very happy, waited for the ink to dry. And just before he was going to fly home, he was so desperate to get home, he switched flights at the last minute. And he wound up on Pan Am Flight 103. Yes. And so, which blew up in the sky over Lockerbie, Scotland, with a bomb wrapped in baby clothes and stuffed in a Samsonite suitcase. So 40 years after the war, this young 36-year-old died in the line of duty trying to convince Austria to do the right thing. And this issue of Germany and Austria resisting has vexed this unit for 3 decades and continues to this day.
And the problem is that even after these people have been found not entitled to have been here, their citizenship has been revoked. Nevertheless, for the very reason that the countries where the crimes were committed are unwilling to prosecute, this country cannot deport them. There has to be a place to which they will be deported.
I was shocked by that. We can't force someone to leave. So they live here as stateless men. The guard that I just told you about, the former Travnicki guard in Queens, New York, who was just deported last year, at the age of 95, had been under deportation orders for 14 years. A judge ordered him deported 14 years before he was eventually sent back to Germany. The Justice Department and the State Department could not convince Germany or any other country to take this man back. So what could they do?
Yeah.
It was outrageous.
So the book obviously is about the Travnicki men and the valiant search for them in this country. Among the Travnicki men, you focused on one particular individual, Jacob Reimer. And it's because of him that the book is called Citizen 865.
That's right.
He wasn't the Citizen 865. And so I'm wondering how
You
it
caught
was
that irony there.
I loved it. And I'm wondering if you could explain to us all how it was that you came up with that title and what's the significance of it.
Well, my husband's not here, but he would take credit for the title, and he would be very proud to tell you it was his title. But Jacob Reimer was the most trusted Travnicki man found in the United States. He was a Red Army lieutenant captured in Poland, recruited for his German language skills. He was actually ethnic German, though he didn't grow up in Germany. And he was recruited by the very men who captured him and sent to the training school at Travnicki, and ended up leading his own platoon in Lublin during that ghetto deportation that I told you about. He helped liquidate some other ghettos in Poland and eventually fought side by side with the Germans to suppress the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, the Jewish resistance in Warsaw. And after the war, he actually fled to Munich, ditched his identity papers. By the way, his SS number was 865, so that's the title of the book. This doesn't show it, but he actually wore a uniform with an 865. But in Munich, he got a job working for the US Army, chauffeuring GIs to Hollywood movies at night. And because he was so nice and so affable and so wonderful, he got recommended by a Red Cross supervisor to come to the United States. I think the quote was, he would make a good citizen or a loyal American. And so Jacob Reimer came to the United States in 1952 on a US Navy ship, sailed into the port of New York, blended into the immigrant community in New York City, opened a Wise potato chip franchise, I think in Brooklyn, lived a very quiet life, got married, had 2 sons, and ultimately retired along the shoreline of Lake Carmel, and would have lived the rest of his life in peace, except that the Justice Department finally caught on to what he had done in occupied Poland. And I should tell you very quickly, Jacob Reimer often talked about the fact that he was a victim of the Nazis, which we hear so much about, right, from defendants. I had no choice. If I didn't pull the trigger, they would have shot me next. Jacob Reimer, as a Travnicki man, received paid vacations. He was able to go home unescorted to see his family. He received 4 service medals. And in 1944, he was granted citizenship in Nazi Germany, meaning he would have ended up in Nazi utopia as a decorated war veteran. So when you start hearing issues of choice, I had no choice, you kind of really wonder, especially in his case.
Yeah, especially in his case.
Yeah.
But it comes up in the book and in other reading that I've done that this was a typical attempt at defense by the Travnicki men and others.
Correct. Yeah, I mean, this is Jacob Reimer's SS issue photo that you can see here. And when he was finally brought to court, this is what Jacob Reimer looked like. And so one of the prosecutors said, it was hard to tell who was the Nazi and who was the Holocaust survivor. How can you tell the difference? One prosecutor said he looked like, someone who could babysit. I mean, he's in sneakers and a sweater. He's an affable older man. He looks like a most ordinary American. And judges several generations removed from the war really had a hard time getting past that. They really did. And in Reimer's case, I should tell you, not only did this unit use Nazi rosters and records, including that record in Prague that I told you about with 700 names on it, Reimer's was one of them, but they brought him in for questioning in 1992. And just on a hunch, the prosecutor said, "There's something you're not telling me, right?" And Reimer went on to describe a mass shooting in the woods outside of Travniki. And he talked about a man in a ravine. They were all lined up, men, women, and children, shot by firing squad. Their bodies fell into the ravine, but there was one man who didn't die right away. And he was pointing to his head, Reimer said, almost as if he were begging for mercy, to be put out of his misery. And Reimer shot at the man, and he admitted this under questioning. And if I may,
Yes, please.
I'd love for you to hear the 20 or so seconds of this.
There's something about the man who pointed to his head that you haven't told me?
Yes.
You finished him off.
I'm afraid so.
So what the prosecutor said is, "There's something about the man that you haven't told me." And Mr. Reimer said, yes. And the prosecutor said, "You finished him off." And Mr. Reimer said, "I'm afraid so." And so even though this unit had that confession and all the documents that described Mr. Reimer's whereabouts during the war, it took a federal judge 4 years to issue a decision in this case. 4 years. And the people inside the Justice Department figured the judge was hoping that Reimer would just die in peace here on US soil. But by the time the Justice Department got this decision 4 years after the trial, they had already asked Germany if they would take him back. Germany said no. Reimer died here in Pennsylvania in 2005. Never deported.
Could you amplify a little bit about how after the 4 years, suddenly there was a decision in that
Yeah.
case?
I mean, I think one of the lawyers said, if we knew who blew up Pan Am 103, would we have, said, well, so much time has passed, it's okay, just let them go? I mean, it was an outrageous delay to the Justice Department. It just weighed on them so heavily because they had spent so many years building a case against this man. And the fact that he was allowed to die here alongside survivors was just, they still talk about it to this day.
Yeah.
He wasn't just the only one who was allowed to die here. 7 or 8 Travniki men died on US soil despite deportation orders. Not 7 or 8 Travniki men, 7 or 8 Nazi defendants, because Austria and Germany wouldn't take them back.
So if we can shift gears just a little bit and tell us, the book has a lot of description of the family lives of the staff, the historians and the attorneys. And I'm interested to know, why was it that you decided to go off, I wouldn't call it a tangent, but to expand the area of the discussion, to talk about a child that was autistic, to talk about somebody who had health problems and such. I think we'd like to know about that.
Well, I wanted to tell a story about the people doing this work. Who were they? How did they do this? How did they process this information? Even for me as a journalist, reading transcripts of the men that they prosecuted, it's chilling, it's disturbing. It's the stuff that keeps you up at night. And so to do this day in and day out, I just wanted to know who they were and what motivated them. What did accountability mean to them? And I really just wanted to get to know them on a one-on-one level. One of the men in the book is a native of Philadelphia. Any Temple grads here? Temple grads? So I will tell you, though he's not a picture in the slideshow, Back in the day, young son of a Philadelphia rabbi named Ned Stutman went to Temple Law School at night, taught in a Catholic school in Camden during the day to pay his law school bills. He did incredible work both for the prosecutor and the public defender's office back in the day here in Philadelphia. Moved to Washington, joined this unit. He was such an incredible prosecutor, so sensitive, not just to the survivors, but also to the defendants. He was careful and meticulous. He prosecuted Jacob Reimer. And has anyone heard of John Demjanjuk, the famous case? What you might not know is Demjanjuk was a Travniki man. Demjanjuk trained at Travniki. It was his base of operation before he went to the Sobibor death camp, which is true if you're watching the Netflix thing on him. He was not at Treblinka, but he was at Sobibor, slightly less terrible than Treblinka, if there's a way to measure that, which there's not. But Ned Stutman of Philadelphia went to Cleveland to prosecute the most notorious OSI defendant, John Demjanjuk. For those who don't know, very briefly, Demjanjuk was accused back in the day of being Ivan the Terrible, this notoriously violent gas chamber operator at the Treblinka death camp. He was sent to Israel. He was ultimately acquitted because he wasn't John Demjanjuk of Treblinka, but he was John Demjanjuk of the Sobibor death camp. So the Justice Department filed a second case against him, and off Ned Stutman went to Cleveland to try this incredible case. The Justice Department lawyers had to go to Janet Reno at the time, the Attorney General, to get special permission to bring this case back because it was, a big deal for them to retry a man, to take him to court twice. So Ned Stutman goes to court in Cleveland. He delivers his opening remarks, and he's in the courtroom for 7-8 hours doing his opening remarks and questioning a witness. Later that night, he called his number 2 lawyer into his hotel room and said, "I need you to take over this case tomorrow." And the young lawyer said, "What do you mean?" And Ned Stutman said, "I have to fly home. I just got a call from my doctor. I have cancer." Turns out Ned got that call within moments of the hearing starting that day, which means that he was basically given news that he had terminal cancer just before he went into the courtroom to take on John Demjanjuk a second time. And he went to court and proceeded, never letting on that he had just been told he had a couple of years to live. And so Ned Stutman went in for cancer treatment, found out that they won the case against Demjanjuk, and then died of cancer sometime later. So he is one of the heroes of this book, and from Philadelphia.
I think we're going to have to come back to the Demjanjuk case in a minute, but
Yeah.
while we're talking about people and you're exploring their lives in the book, I think we need to talk about Felix and Lucy. Mm-hmm. And so could you tell us a little bit about who are
Yes.
Felix and Lucy, and why it was that you decided to include their stories in the book as well?
Thank you for asking that. So I say in the prologue of this book that I see this as a book about darkness, but also about light. It is not a dreary book about so many dark moments. Felix and Lucy are the heart of this story. And I remember hearing their story for the first time, sitting at my desk until 2 a.m. I could not move. I could not get up. I wanted to hear the end of their story. So Felix and Lucy were 2 teenagers in Lublin, Poland. Remember I told you that's where the Travniki men surrounded the perimeter of the Lublin ghetto. They were among 40,000 Jews who lived in Poland. They were young. They were teenagers. And Felix's father was an architect. Lucy's father was a court interpreter. Her mother was a dentist. They were relatively affluent. They lived in Lublin. And they watched their entire families die. Lucy's brother David, Lucy's parents, Felix's parents and sister. They survived because Felix's father, the architect, carved a double door in a wall in a bathroom, and Lucy and Felix were able to hide while the Travniki men and others rounded up the Jews for deportation. Lucy and Felix escaped to Warsaw. And with nowhere to go in Warsaw, what do? They go into the Jewish ghetto in Warsaw. And just before the uprising, for whatever reason, they decided they needed to get out, likely save their lives. And so with help from the Polish underground, they escaped. And they ended up moving into a small farming village outside of Krakow. And they were hiding in plain sight as Jews. Felix actually became a teacher and started teaching the Polish children who hadn't gone to school since the start of the war. And one day, Felix heard the rumbling of tanks. And on his hands and knees, he crawled through the forest and saw Soviet tanks approaching. Liberation, liberation. And so a Soviet commander comes into the office and he says into the village, and he says to Felix, "Who are you?" And for the first time since the start of the war, Felix said, "I'm a teacher here, but I'm also a Jew." And the commander said, "You can't be a Jew. All the Jews are dead. You must be a spy." Felix said, no, I'm really a Jew. So the commander calls one of his younger soldiers over and he goes, "Come over here. You're a Jew." He says he's a Jew. Speak Yiddish to each other. So poor Felix grew up in a very assimilated home in Poland. His father used to bring in a rabbi to give him lessons at the kitchen table. And when the rabbi nodded off, Felix would flip to the back of the prayer book. So when the rabbi woke up, he'd say, "Look, I finished my lessons. I'm a good boy." So here he is, starving, scared, finally acknowledging for the first time in years that he's a Jew, and now he's forced to speak, Hebrew or Yiddish. He doesn't remember any of it, but from the depths of his soul, he remembered a single prayer that his father made sure he learned, and it was the Shema. I choke up because it just gets to me. And so he recites the Shema, and the Soviet soldier hugged him and said, "You really are a Jew." And so Felix and Lucy were able to survive the war, go home to Lublin. They walked 70 kilometers through the snow to see if anyone was left. And out of 40,000 Jews in Lublin, fewer than 200 survived, including Felix and Lucy, who I should tell you married in the Warsaw ghetto under the cover of night with a borrowed wedding dress and a spit of wine. And a woman walked up to Lucy and she pulled the wedding ring off her finger and said, "You take it. Maybe it will bring you better luck." And so Lucy and Felix ended up going to Vienna, where Felix finished medical school. And then they came over to the United States in 1951. And exactly a year later, Jacob Reimer, Citizen 865, followed. Could you imagine what Lucy and Felix felt years later when they learned that the very same men who had persecuted their neighbors' family and friends, who took away everyone they ever loved, could you imagine what they felt when they found out they were living in the United States? And so that's why I included Lucy and Felix in the book, because they outran the men of Travniki and the SS, only to find that some of those same men were living here alongside them. And by the way, I just spent time the other night with Lucy and Felix's family, who I think I've never met Lucy and Felix, but something brought us together.
Sure.
And when I say the story is about darkness, but also about light, this is what I mean. This is Lucy and Felix. They left behind a family of 11. Felix died in his 90s in an armchair watching a hockey game. And Lucy said to her son, "I will not live 6 more months without him. I just want you to know I'm not going to live 6 more months without him." And if you think about it, all they had really was each other. They had these shared memories. Felix was the only one who ever knew Lucy's parents or her brother. Lucy was the only one who ever knew Felix's parents and his sister. And true to her word, she died 6 months later on what would have been the 70th anniversary of their wedding in the Warsaw Ghetto. That's why I say the story is also about light. because of that.
Very much so.
Yeah.
Thank you. I have one last somewhat complicated question, and it relates to the Demjanjuk case. You quoted Dr. Peter Black as having remembered the title of a couple of chapters in an Isaac Asimov novel. I haven't found that novel yet, but I'm
It exists,
interested.
yes.
So the title of one of those chapters he recounted was The Answer That's...
That's true versus
The Answer That's Satisfied.
versus the answer that's
And the other chapter was The Answer That's True.
yeah.
So it seemed to me that this fits the Demjanjuk case with a third title that we'll get to. So what was the troubling thing about the Demjanjuk case is that we had, in the first instance, a series of eyewitness testimony from survivors, all of whom, telling the truth as they knew it, testified that this man, John Demjanjuk, was Ivan the Terrible, and they saw him, they will never forget his face, they saw him at Treblinka.
They pulled his picture out of a lineup. I mean, it was from witnesses from all over pulled his picture out of a lineup.
So that was, and the court credited all of those eyewitnesses and stripped him of his citizenship. He was deported. He was sent to Israel for criminal trial. We were talking about that a little earlier this evening, that other than the trial of Adolf Eichmann, this was the only other criminal trial in Israel of a perpetrator of the Holocaust. And during that trial, the same eyewitnesses and others testified that, yes, indeed, this is John Demjanjuk, the Ivan the Terrible at Treblinka. And he was convicted and sentenced, just like Adolf Eichmann, he was sentenced to death, took an appeal, and the timing couldn't have been better for him because that's when the Iron Curtain had fallen and records suddenly became available to OSI. And can you pick up the story there?
Well, I mean, he had been sentenced to death in Israel before he was acquitted. I think it's important to know that the first case against Demjanjuk was started before OSI was created.
Yeah.
And before OSI had historians who understood that memories could be fragile and fleeting, and that as well-intentioned as survivors are, documents are, far more foolproof than 40-year-old memories. And so Demjanjuk was acquitted by an Israeli court because he was not, in fact, Ivan the Terrible of Treblinka. But one historian said, yeah, but he was Ivan the slightly less terrible of the Sobibor death camp. And so John Demjanjuk was allowed to come back to the United States, move back into his life in Cleveland. And that's when the historians in the book were able to mine the archives of Eastern Europe, and they found exactly where Demjanjuk has served. And because they understood Travniki as being Demjanjuk's base camp, the place that armed him, empowered him, and deployed him, because they saw the big picture, they were able to successfully file a new case against him. And in fact, they were able to strip him of his citizenship a second time. And in a rare act of, I shouldn't say rare, but Germany agreed to take Demjanjuk back. And so he was sent back to Germany. He was tried, and he was found guilty in the murders of 28,000 people in the Sobibor death camp. He died while his appeal was pending, which means under German law, he is not convicted.
Correct. Under American law as well.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. So first you have the answer that's satisfied, which was Ivan the Terrible of Treblinka. Then you had the answer that was true, which was the Israel Supreme Court vacated the conviction because
And rightfully
he was
so.
not Ivan the Terrible
Right.
of Treblinka.
Right.
And then you eventually get the answer that's both true and satisfied.
That's a good way of putting it.
Which is he did get his citizenship again stripped,
Yep.
and he was sent to Germany.
Yeah, and the historians in the book were very troubled by the first case because the documents did not bear out that he was Ivan the Terrible of Treblinka. And they wanted to correct the record of history. So they were very troubled that he had been put on death row in Israel when the historians at OSI suspected he was not Ivan the Terrible. Peter Black, the historian that you just described, I mean, it rattled him because, you know, he didn't believe in the death penalty anyway, but then you have a man sentenced to death for a service record that was inaccurate. It was horrifying to the historians at OSI, but very satisfying when they corrected the record of history.
So it seemed to me that looking at this scenario of the three answers, that the Demjanjuk case, and we'll pick up with questions from the audience after this, the Demjanjuk case really raises questions about or issues of professional and personal ethics of prosecutors, and it also raises questions about our judicial processes. Here we have a person who, on the basis of eyewitness testimony, is convicted of things technically he did not commit. And it is true that the institutions, the judicial institutions, ultimately corrected the mistake, but nevertheless, it does raise some serious questions about mistakes made in our courts.
And it did at the time. And the office, in fact, Eli Rosenbaum, the director of the Office of Special Investigations, for the first time in his career, when someone asked him, what do you do for a living? He would say, I'm a lawyer at the Justice Department, and leave it at that. He didn't want to say he was in the Nazi hunting unit at the Justice Department because the Demjanjuk case was really a black eye for this unit. And so imagine they've got Pat Buchanan and others going after them, and suddenly they make a pretty big mistake, an internationally watched, internationally criticized mistake. And the fact that they were able to continue on after they made that mistake to successfully prosecute him, to rightfully prosecute him based on accurate information was a big victory for them. And you should know that though that mistake was made and they were heavily criticized for it, this tiny office in the outpost of the Justice Department that I described to you prosecuted more Nazi perpetrators since 1990 than all other countries in the world combined, including Germany.
Well, that's good. As I'm turning to some of the questions that I've received from you in the audience, that sort of answers one. In case you have anything to add, I will. Let me see, I just saw that here. How many of these men who were deported were put on trial in Europe?
Yeah, not a lot. And that's a great question. They were deported, some of them died here, but it wasn't just the Nazis found on US soil who didn't face, trial at the end of the day. There were people in the SS who were tried and acquitted, who went on to live very peaceful lives. That's almost a conversation for another day about accountability after the Holocaust. But I was surprised as a journalist and an author at the lack of accountability. In fact, the SS commander in charge of the Travniki training camp, this school for mass murder, was a man named Karl Streibel. They found him living in Hamburg in 1970. So he had lived quietly until 1970. They found him. They charged him in mass murder, and he was acquitted by a German court.
Yeah.
And he went on to live a very peaceful life. So the issue of accountability abroad is another it's a big issue.
There are a couple of questions here that I'll try and summarize, put together. They deal with something else that happened after World War II with regard to Nazis. And that's one of the questioners refers to Operation Paperclip.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Specifically, the other refers to Dr. Werner von Braun. And these are references to the fact that our government brought over known Nazi scientists and military officials to help in the fight against communism. And I'm wondering if you have any comments, especially in light of all of the efforts of the OSI that you studied so assiduously.
How do I answer that one? Because I'm asked it at every event, and it's such a good question. The U.S. didn't want Nazi scientists to fall into the hands of the Soviets. Remember, it was the Cold War, so the Soviets were public enemy number one. I don't have to tell this group that. You know that. And so I think the people inside OSI would tell you that the number of Nazi scientists brought over has been greatly exaggerated, that it wasn't hundreds and hundreds, it was a smaller number. But in fact, it did happen, and I did not go into that in this book because other books have been written about Operation Paperclip. Yeah. I focused specifically on the Travnicki investigation because it had never been reported before. And in fact, all the information about Travnicki was in there was no textbook or encyclopedia. I had to get it directly from the historians who did the work. So it was 3 years of research and reporting in 5 countries.
So one member of the audience wants to know, what, if anything, did President Truman know about these war criminals, if you know?
Wow, that is a really good question. I can't speak to all of the war criminals, but I can tell you in the case of Travnicki, the U.S. Army had absolutely no idea what this training camp was. They just didn't know until the Justice Department got involved.
So another question, where do we go from here? If there are a few Nazis still left in the United States?
Yeah, I have no official word if there are any Nazi perpetrators left in the United States. I suspect there might be a handful, or at least one more case. I don't know. I'm just guessing, but I don't know. And we were talking about this earlier. It's terrible. It's a scary time right now. We're seeing such a rise in hate crimes and anti-Semitism. We just saw that in Jersey City and in 2 synagogues here in the U.S. And it's a scary time. I dedicated this book to my boys who are in college because I want them to know and understand what they can. And where do we go from here? I think we keep these issues public, we keep talking about it, and we pass them on.
One last question. You talk a lot in the book about how the investigators and the historians were able to live their personal lives while working by day at such horrifying tasks. How did writing this book affect your personal life?
Yeah. Well, I thought it would be easy to write a book about the Holocaust. I don't know what I was thinking.
I don't either.
I figured, well, I'm Jewish. I can write about the Holocaust. And I learned that you can't write about history unless you understand context. You can't write about Nazi Germany between 1939 and 1945 unless you understand what happened 50 years before and 50 years after. You really need context. And so I spent months interviewing the historians. I retraced their steps. This is what the Travnicki training camp looks like today. I went to Travnicki. There's nothing left that a tiny little plaque in the corner of nowhere to commemorate what happened there. So, it took a toll on me because I was living in those moments with the historians. But I was able to actually retrace their steps. I went back to Prague. Remember I told you they were there in 1990 and found that Nazi roster? Took me 3 days in Prague to find the original Nazi roster that they found with Jacob Reimer's name on it. They made me put gloves on my hand because the oil from your
Sure.
fingers gets into documents. And so in retracing their steps, in some ways I felt like I was living it alongside them. And I remember one of the historians in the book, when he went to Travniki for the first time, he said, I felt like I was walking on the bodies of the dead. And you can't go to Poland and not feel that way. So it took a toll, and but it also gave me hope that there are people out there who want to see the right thing happen and believe that accountability matters and that justice, even delayed justice, matters at a time when we're seeing horrible things happen all over the world. And so as an investigative reporter, and I'll end it with this, I've spent 25 years writing about the worst in human nature, greed and corruption and mismanagement. I mean, I was in Miami and Washington, go figure. Low-hanging fruit, right? And so I really spent 20-some years writing about the worst human nature. And in this book, in writing about the people inside the Justice Department who believed in accountability more than anything else, I felt like I was writing about the best in human nature, people who were moving the needle in the other direction. And so yes, it was a dark book to write, but I left feeling good and hopeful and inspired by the heroes of this book.
Well, thank you very, very much. You
course.
indeed have contributed a lot.
Yeah, thank you.
Wonderful.
Thank you, Dean. Appreciate it very much. You did great.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you.